So welcome everyone to Telesis and the Architecture Student Journal. This journal is possible thanks to the support of the College of Architecture at the University of Oklahoma. And today we will be talking about the essence of place. We will be discussing with Stephen Ferroni about critical regionalism. I have the pleasure to introduce Stephen. He's a PhD student specialized in urbanism. He studied at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he did his master's degree there, but now he's pursuing his PhD as well. I believe he's a first-year PhD student. He has been working also 2 years before that time as an architect in Chicago, in the Chicago area. And his research interests are the ever-evolving conversation between person, building, and city. Some of his research questions are: what role do individual buildings projects play in creating the image of the city at both local and global scales? And what constitutes this image, and who is seeking to manipulate it? Welcome, Stephen, to this platform, to this class, Telesis. We are very happy to have you here and share a little bit about your knowledge about critical regionalism, a little bit of phenomenology, and the insights of actually your work as a PhD student as well.
As we introduced us, today's talk is about the essence of place, discussions about critical regionalism. It's a fairly loaded term, and one which I hope we can kind of slowly unpack in the next 45 minutes. There's a fine line between critical regionalism and historicism, phenomenology, and vernaculars as well. So it's kind of inserted a bit in between these a few terms in architecture: experientialism, phenomenology, vernaculars, and then critical regionalism. All of these in common have their effort on placemaking and kind of keeping a close connection to the location in which the project is built and conceptualized. To do this, I first will talk about a few paintings, and then I'll start showing some representation of spaces from the 18th century. And from there, we'll move on to actually architectural examples. And I really only have 3 case studies for today, as I think it's much more important to talk about the ideas and the actual example itself, more so how the idea relates and how the idea is deployed in many different scenarios. I want to emphasize that none of this emphasis on place is a 20th century thing. It's been going on really forever. And none of this emphasis on feelings that, postmodernism started was a new thing either. The important thing to know is that these things are happening because there was a complete break from historicism and from a historical continuity, which was jump-started by the Enlightenment and then by modernity itself. Because the talk is really about how we can build with essential ways of building. There's a fantastic Louis Kahn quote in which he says, they say to a brick, "What do you want, brick?" And brick says to you, "I like an arch." And then that's his way of saying every material within itself has embodied a way by which it can be used and by which it can be deployed into a building in a pure and essential way. And Louis Kahn is one of those fantastic masters of the 20th century who's obviously always doing this. So essence, in a way, it's an idea of using elements for what they are, and it relies on understanding of what a material or technique is and how to use it. Very often than not, it's very much rooted in a historical tradition of craftsmen, as we saw, in this slide of the vernaculars. It's something that is spontaneously done by tradesmen. It doesn't really have any architect behind or any sort of meta narrative that is driving its design. And very much the actual use of the material very often is connected to how vernaculars are using it. Although we'll see it's deployed also in terms of forms or in terms of just ideas or a transportation of different typologies into a new way of doing things. This practice of building with what is perhaps locally available was, as I said, disrupted by modernity, but also by globalization and the free markets flows, simply because now we have access to a variety of different building materials that perhaps are even cheaper of what is locally available because of these free market trade agreements and because of cheap and fast transportation. I wanted to discuss these paintings simply because I think they help kind of understanding how we are detached from place and placemaking and architecture in some way, how especially during modernism this was attached. I will start discussing these paintings, and these are just simply like visual cues that I'm trying to, I guess, provoke. I think you're probably familiar with all of these. On the left-hand side, we have The Nighthawk by Edward Hopper, and on the right-hand side, there is a composition with red and blue and yellow by Piet Mondrian. These are really about 10 years apart. One of them, though, is depicting a geographically anonymous but a typical condition in an American urban environment. It's a diner. The assumption is that it is in New York. Possibly it is in New York, but there really is no reality to this. And the fact that already in 1942, there was an idea of what an American urban environment looked like, but that exact urban environment and that exact anonymity of what city is this is actually really fascinating and very much connected to these ideas of critical regionalism. Simply because while there is, a geographic boundary that is, this is an American urban environment, we actually have no idea which specific urban environment this is. And this is because there is nothing that is really idiosyncratic about this image. It could be Boston, it could be New York, it could be virtually almost any city. On the right-hand side, instead, we have a pure representation of what was going on in the first half of the 20th century. It is a completely abstract painting, and it represents kind of how modernity valued rationality over feelings, it valued synchronization over place, and it's really a good representation of how technocratic of an endeavor modernity was and how much they were interested in the here and now and what it was technically possible, more so than they were interested in representing any sort of moods or feelings or urban environments, such as the painting on the left. The next couple of paintings on the left-hand side, we have Stand Station by Ed Ruscha, and the right-hand side, Orange Stand by Mark Rothko. The left-hand side one, again, is a fairly anonymous environment, although we all know exactly where this is situated, right? When we think about this, we know that we can position ourselves along a highway, along an interstate, somewhere, perhaps in, I don't know, I was thinking of the flat plains of Illinois, for instance, but it was representing a prefabricated topology that was to be deployed across America, the oil station or the gas station, to meet a demand. And so it needed to be built fast, needed to build in a way that was allowing for people to interpret it and understand exactly what to do with it. It was an easy way to engage with it. They put the coins in, take the fuel out, take the fuel pump out, place it in your car and refuel your car. So once again, here we have an example of something that is possibly anonymous in terms of its connecting tissue to a specific location, but it is still indeed an American place, right? The one on the right is instead something that I think is really fascinating. Generally speaking, I guess almost every big art museum has a Mark Rothko painting, and I think it's really interesting to try to understand what people think about it and what people say about it. I always see a window outside looking at the sea. I then learned that Rothko's paintings are really not about what it is representing, more so about what it makes you feel. Some see happiness, some see sadness. Some of them are purple, have different hues, and are depicting different feelings. And I think this is an essential quality of also in architecture, and especially so in phenomenology, but also as related to critical regionalism. And it is really about the essence of the feeling. If you've never looked into Mark Rothko's work, they look very much similar, but the way by nature produced, they're very, very interesting. It is really a teasing out on what the medium of paint can actually do. By rotating the canvas, he was, eliminating any sort of like directionality, and he always kind of rotated. And you can see how this is happening also in this painting at the top. The free flow is the flow of the water is flowing. But then if you look at the change of color from the orange to tan, you see the same happening, which means he rotated the canvas itself in order to represent this and kind of blur out the boundaries between the two colors. So it really isn't about what it is representing, but more so about what it makes you feel. He was very close to Mies van der Rohe, which I think was quite interesting, and he was commissioned to design the paintings for the Seagram buildings. These were never hung and actually are, I think, owned by the Tate, but they rotate around the world. And they're these big murals that were meant to, kind of drop down in space. And I think the juxtaposition of Rothko's work versus the very rational, abstract Mies van der Rohe environment would have been quite interesting and quite striking, and I'm kind of bummed that it happened. And it's an environment that I really wish I could go and see. Again, it is really about what it makes you feel, and that really none of this emphasis on feelings or on placemaking are new, but they're quite, instead we're discovering them, and this is a critical aspect of critical regionalism. I think the hardest people to understand is what is critical and what is regionalism. But once you really, I think, build up and tease out the separation of the two, you understand that critical regionalism is really a response to something, a response to modernity, and a desire to reconnect with the place. I'm saying this because now I'll dive back a few centuries, and I'll go to the 19th century, discussing an urban environment which was produced simply as a painting, but it is indeed an architectural painting. It's designed by Piranesi, who was a Roman painter. He is representing Rome, and he's really trying, it's all fictional, but he's trying to represent the aura and the feeling of being in between the Roman ruins. It's a picturesque representation. Picturesque is aesthetic idea that kind of came around in the 19th century, and it is part of the Romantic movement. So the Romantic movement was that movement which is doing exactly what critical regionalism is doing for the Enlightenment. So it is an emphasis really on feelings and structures of feeling. Romanticism, right? It's a fight against something. So it is really tangential to what we're talking about today. This representation becomes somewhat phenomenological, as it is representing the fallen power of the Roman Empire. And it's trying to tease out these ideas of the sublime being the most heightened level of beauty which any sort of environment can achieve, any sort of place can achieve. And you can see, in fact, that it's quite, let's say, in how we would say it today, it's very moody. But there are some features and some qualities of this that are specifically about Rome and about being within the Roman Empire's fallen ruins, right? These are in a high state of decay. They're depicted as if they were bigger than what they actually are, in order to emphasize this grandiosity of the fallen empire. Next up, I will show a painting that is of similar years. That was developed by Louis-Étienne Boulet, who's, I think, one of my most favorite individuals to study and to learn about in history of architecture. And he was trying to come up with an idea of a new royal library. And this royal library was, in fact, indeed for the monarch. It was in those years in between the revolution, right after Napoleon's reign, or actually right before Napoleon's reign. But yet it was still a monarchy, so it was, before the revolution. It was speculatively designed for, I think, the 10th Royal Library or something, and it's representing what modern France can look like. So there already were ideas by Rousseau and by the writers about what an Enlightenment could look like, what modernity could look like, what a modern sovereign state would look like. And this is evident in simply the fact that, generally speaking, books were kept in these dark hallways, chained actually at the bookshelf. And nobody could really go and pick up a book and walk around and read it elsewhere. Whereas here it's pretty evident that there is a desire for the book to be picked up and to walk around it, to enjoy the space and actually discuss. And when you look into these different ideas of what sovereign states are trying to do, they're trying to educate citizens, they're trying to have them build up knowledge, and kind of, it comes hand in hand with the building of a middle class. Yet again, all this, as beautiful as it sounds, was designed for a monarch, and there are some elements of this which are recalling classicism. You can see the colonnades, you can see the coffered ceiling and the barrel vault. So they're really still not quite modern, but they're definitely certainly classical. They're not as enlightened as modernity. It's not a complete break from the past. I think it's important to discuss this because even here, there is an idea of what, France should look like. But this idea is about to change in the next century, as France is undergoing an effort to build a national identity with architecture, as it became a republic and it became a more democratic state. There was a desire to find what is the true root of French architecture, and they found that Gothic architecture was their true architecture. Slowly they started tearing apart old buildings and removing the imperfections that were built upon them over the years. One of the most famous examples is the renovation of Saint-Chapelle, which was done initially by Viollet-le-Duc and then a few other architects. And this effort to find the true French architecture, I think, is fundamental in understanding also critical regionalism, because it is still trying to create an identity for what France was, and it goes hand in hand with the act of nation building and of state building. There's an emphasis on these vertical lines and large spans in between spaces, full of light. And even with these new technologies of cast iron, you see on the left-hand side, those skinny columns that are in cast iron, in fact, as proposed by Lambrust and other architects, these, although built with new materials, they are already, they're trying to recall the motifs and the geometries of Gothic architecture. As I was saying, they looked at the past and cleaned up the past. They removed elements which weren't quite of the Middle Ages, that weren't quite depicting the ideas of what Gothic architecture ought to be. But here we'll see that because they're employing modern technologies, they're trying and starting to understand actually what they can do with this space. And here, the idea of what they can do is slowly taking over versus what they're trying to be or who they're trying to represent. And I'm saying this, and this is, I think, evident because the slenderness of the columns, because of the motifs that are still happening. And this is indeed like not quite yet modern, not quite yet international style, but it's slowly going towards it. There is rationality in how the program is laid out. If you notice, all the books are on the perimeter. This is actually a national library that was built by Henry Lambrust, and it follows very much these rational principles of design and of planning as it happened in the middle of the 19th century. Slowly, you will see that these ideas of rationality, of abstraction, of simplifying your program are kind of slowly taking over. And it's what led then to, our complete break from the past that is modernity. And it's what led to, and forgive me for this jump in 75 years, or if not more, in architectural history, but it's kind of what led to the condition that then we had in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, where we started seeing more anonymous cityscapes that are really about what can you do with current technologies and what can you do, how can you build in the most effective, efficient, fast way. And so we see buildings like on the left, Ville Savoie, which I think, we know is in France, we know it is in the middle of a countryside, but do we really know that? What's telling us it's there? Like, it could be absolutely anywhere. Same thing with the right-hand side images of the glassy towers, which are, adorned everywhere. I think especially so about the glass tower, there is no evidence of decay in the glass versus other materials such as stone or brick. Like, the glass doesn't actually hold any of that age value that we can describe it. And so it is really taking away from context. It's really creating a vacuum around it. And this could be absolutely anywhere. I believe this is in the suburb of Chicago, but it really could be in Southern Oklahoma. It could be in China. There are plentiful buildings that look exactly like this around the world. And it's really about modernity trying to find what is the zeitgeist of the time, what is the here and now, how can we build and how can we design something that is representing of our era. But in doing so, it has lost completely that connection to place and to placemaking. It's very anonymous. There is really no recollection to its vernacular, to its historical. Slowly, the MoMA, who is the biggest entity who discusses architecture and provides different ideas for what architecture ought to be and what architecture should be over the years, did a few various exhibits. The one on the left is Architecture of the Architects. It came from a book from Rodowski. And the one on the right is after a paper by 1983 paper by Kenneth Frampton. It's really about architecture needing to find this balance between enlightened ideas and this new ways of building things, new technology, new abstract values, and then also the unrealistic impulse to kind of return to historic forms of the past, of the pre-industrial past specifically, because really we tend to be very binary in our thinking sometimes as architects, and we either skew in a certain way towards the completely abstract or actually replicate and create historicisms that are really not critical in the way they're built. They're not really connected to how they're building in those days. Again, it wasn't really a concerted effort of architects, but it's really just a sensibility which some architects worldwide had, and started these conversations about, well, within their location, what is actually what the style in which we should build in, and how should we actually build within our environment. It is really reconnecting to a place, not just as an abstract, distant political boundary, but as really a concrete feeling of a location, whether that be a stream, whether that be a hillside, whether that be a way in which something was built historically in a specific location. The critical aspect in all of this is that architecture needs to remove itself from both the optimization of advanced technology and the ever-present tendency to regress into nostalgic historicisms or the glib decorative. And this is one of the lines out of the Frampton reading that you might have done. My very simple example for this is a Folly pavilion designed by Carlo Scarpa. He was an Italian architect. He mostly worked around the area of Venice. He designed the entry booth to the Venice Giardini, where they do the Biennale, which is this big exhibit thing for architects, for art, for cinema, where really every country kind of had its own pavilion. I put up images of two of the pavilions. The top right one is by James Sterling, and it's, I think, a bookshop. And the bottom one is it's the Scandinavian pavilion, so for really all Scandinavian countries, by Sven Fair. And these are quite remarkable, and it's incredible to visit his garden and see all these pavilions by who's who of architecture. I believe Carlo Scarpa has another pavilion there. There is one by Alvarado, and there's a few other famous architects who have operated in this context. The ticket booth is located where the arrow is at the entry, and it's slightly offset from the middle of that roadway, simply because they wanted to maintain an axis of visibility across the main hallway and towards the end of the Giardini. It is a very remarkable and small building. Immediately when you look at it, it kind of resembles the way in which ships are built. Venice is, historically known for its shipbuilding, for being a maritime mercantile city. And then with this, all these little elements of the way this is built are recalling parts of ships. So for instance, you can see in the right-hand image, the wooden column is resembling the mast, and then the way the ribs work on the roof are resembling the ribs of a ship. Sails are actually used to create a shading canopy and kind of create that kind of cross ventilation in between the roof and the top of the actual ticket booth. And then further on, there is, the very resemblance of the gravel within that wall, the concrete wall. It's a material called chippo, which I think is prevalent almost around the world, and it's really just crushed together gravel with poured with concrete, and it's quite remarkable, and it's very much used as a base throughout Europe, but also I think I've seen it in America. And you can see how the height of that is connected to the exterior boundary and the top left image where the ivy is. And so there is really this close attention to how it is built for this specific location, both in the way it is connecting to a simple boundary of a garden, but also to the ways in which it is built and the traditional ways by which these are constructed. Moving forward, I'll present the first case study. It is a building which is in Milan. It's a home. It was built in 1963, I believe, 1966. After the bombing of Milan city center in World War II, there was a question about what style should we rebuild buildings within the city center in. And slowly architects kind of started this dialogue about finding a sense of a regional identity that is specifically Milanese. On the right-hand side, you see this image, and all the black patches are actually buildings that were either completely or gravely destroyed by bombs that were dropped during World War II. On the left is this basilica, which is the symbol of Milan, actually the saint of Milan being Sant'Ambrogio, which was almost completely destroyed. Milan is organized with concentric rings, and you can kind of see it in this image, all of this is now considered, these are really the boundaries of the historic city center of Milan, the Renaissance boundaries, and then the inner circle is actually the Middle Age boundaries of the city of Milan. It's a common typology in which a city is organized. Vienna kind of repeats this. And these where the old walls were existing, they were built these streets. And so these streets are still actually acting as a threshold in between different textures, different typologies of buildings, and so on, and different density levels as well within the city of Milan. The building we're looking at and discussing is the one in the bigger image on the right. It's called Casa Pirelli, for the owner of the company Pirelli, which is producing tires for mostly high-performance vehicles. But back in the days, it was really also utilitarian. It's a fairly simple building, and that's kind of perhaps why I appreciate it so much. And I'm sure that across the years, I've discussed this building with you, Felipe, before. It is heavily inspired by this typology of the farmhouse building, and the name for it in Italian is cascina. And you can see an example of that on the bottom left. This one was renovated into a restaurant. These farmhouse buildings were at the middle of the fields in which agricultural workers would work around it and go and have lunch there, go and bring all their product there that they were picking up. And so many of these have been slowly absorbed within the city texture of Milan, and so many still exist very far away of it. And it kind of creates this very interesting juxtaposition between more modern aesthetics and buildings and these older structures. Generally, they're used for civic duties, or some of them are still actually kind of falling apart and so finding a new way of being used. You can see it immediately, just the color, the plaster, but it is inspired heavily by that as a typology, but it also has these modern features that are really finessed and fascinating. It was the first commission of this architect, Luigi Cacciadominioni, and it was really a test of all his ideas, namely and especially these recessed shutters, which are perhaps more visible in this image. You see how the windows are tucked in. There is a creation of a mass and void relationship. And these shutters kind of open, and when you do open the shutters, they still remain within the main volume of the building. It's a more refined detail of the usual shutter building, let's say. It's connected to its environment with its space at the bottom, which is a dominant feature within Milanese architecture, especially within the city center. And it has these gutters, which are kind of like creating these local symmetries. If you can see it, the green gutter, and then it has these volumes protruding at the top, which are kind of breaking apart the otherwise very simple volume. The fenestration pattern is really driven by the interior. As you can see from the floor plan, it's generally at the center of each room, and you can see it perhaps better in these floor plans. And it's creating really it's removing really all sorts of meta narratives and all sorts of unifying symmetry and principles across the facade. There are though some things that are kind of coming out here, and you can see here on the right hand side image the glass block that is kind of breaking up the volume of the longer side of this rectangular building, and it's creating a local symmetry around the corner, which is matched to the shorter side. And you can see on the left-hand side kind of a detailed shot of those gutters, and you can really see how there isn't really a clear pattern of what's driving what is the window doing, although you can kind of see that in some instances, for instance, at the top, that kind of ribbon window is broken up, but really its presence reads as a horizontal ribbon window, which is classical of modern buildings, right? When you think about their emphasis and their inspiration from ships. Although it is broken up, but because of the shutters and because of how the shutters are positioned within the wall itself, they are able to kind of create this very horizontal reading of them. It is quite distinct, but it's not opposed to modernism, and it's not even opposed to tradition. It's kind of positioning itself almost in the middle and in a symmetrical relationship between the two. For me, I appreciate this building because it is somewhat of it has beauty in plain sight, and it is really completely hidden in the city, and it brought many people to see it, and they all are kind of surprised that this is a remarkable building for architecture simply because it's not flashy and it's not quite in your face, let's say. It's not something that's trying to be loud. It is really refined and simple, yet again, quite well thought out. It isn't really just about reinterpreting the city. It is about it's not about creating a new typology, but it's really about the materials, the forms, and it's trying to create a conversation with its content. It's trying to fit in, and it's trying to create a dialogue about what it is that we should be building in and how should we be building in within the city center of Milan. This is an image that is straight across from the building in front of it, which I took when I was visiting, and it is kind of showing that there are these local symmetries, right? These windows there are pretty symmetrical to one another, but again, the patterns which they're defined are in quite meta-narratives themselves, such as you could have in a more modernist tradition. In this floor plan, you also see how the entrance to each room is laid out in such a way that you enter the main rooms, the living rooms, on a diagonal, and this is meant to emphasize the size of the room further on, as the diagonal is the longest size. It's kind of a small trick, which he's kind of doing. And you can see also in the floor plan on the right, on the top, that kind of the relationship between the roofscape that is really simple, just a gable, and these volumes are kind of protruding, one of the main volumes being the stairwell. Something I didn't mention is that one of the things that he would always do as an architect, one of his signatures, let's say, is that he always positioned this glass block cylinder exactly in front of the fenestration. And here you can see it in front of the circulation. And here you can see it in front of that oval stairway. I have some close-up shots. There's this hidden doorbell, which is piece of stone built on a pivot. And it's kind of emphasizing the privacy of the owner, being a wealthy individual. And then the house actually was built for him and two of his friends. And if you look closely at the doorbell, there's actually no names on it. It's really just, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I think the actual, door in front of it emphasizes this idea and those fear of being in the public eye. On the right-hand side, you see how the gutter is actually recessed within the corner, which takes it takes a lot to coordinate as a contractor to actually design it like that and build it this way and to have it be so refined. And I think it's incredibly remarkable and it's a fantastic detail. I will discuss my second example. It's a museum of anthropology for the University of British Columbia. It's located at the edge of its campus. It's designed by an Canadian architect called Erickson. He studied actually at this university and then for engineering and then transferred to McGill for architecture. His emphasis is really on trying to be in touch with the local climate after traveling, especially to the Mediterranean region where, to Greece, especially where there are white homes that are cross-ventilated and reflecting the heat and the sun and so on. And he fully rejected these revival styles. But although, as you can see, it is quite abstract, right? This could be a brutalist building if you don't know what it's coming from. And knowing where it's coming from, as you can see, kind of like teased in the facade, you can see these totems of the First Nations, which are kind of like the inspiration, the true inspiration about this building. He favored synthesis over actually citing elements. He favored structure and creating this synthesis of ideas with structure versus actual ornamentation, and kind of like the essence of an actual building more so than the actual image of what it's trying to show. And I think this is kind of speaks very much to today's talk. There's always an attention to light, to water features, kind of create a mood that's really landscaping around the building was very much well thought out. And he built really throughout the world still in his career, but always trying to reconnect with this. Here you see on the left, the Museum of Anthropology. And then if you've been to the UBC campus, there is this, it's a very much a legislative organization similar to U of I's Felipe, but in a way smaller and narrow campus and main promenade. And this promenade itself is sloping up and down, and you will see how this sloping is actually happening also within the building itself. Because this building can really look like a brutalist building, and because it is really abstract, I think it's important to discuss some of his projects. I'm showing just one example that was for the 1967 Expo in Montreal, and it's really unfortunately not there anymore. It was a pavilion for demand a community. It's heavily inspired by the form of TPs of the First Nations of Canada. And it's built with these large spruce fir beams that are laid in hexagons of diminishing sizes and rotated every other one. And it's really juxtaposed to the building that this picture is taken from, which is Habitat 67, which by Moshe Safdie, which I think you're familiar with, which is really about abstracting and understanding how to build in a prefabricated way, which is completely rational. So it's really just one is the coding of the past of other typologies, and one is instead the pure critical effort of understanding how can you build something quickly in a very modular, very repeated pattern. And so I think it would have been still remarkable to see these two buildings next to each other, but unfortunately they've been demolished. To give a little more context about what was happening, then this expo happened towards the end of the post-war boom, which obviously was happening also in Canada, not just in America. In this boom, the boundaries, the territories of cities, of really just nations were completely demolished, favoring globalism, and high-end modernism was the dominant narrative really in architecture at that time. There's also a huge effort to create central cores for cities and for this modes of production which are really connected to mass production and mass consumption. And so this building already is kind of like a switch for it. It's already embracing the plurality of the different nations which exist within, in this case, Canada. And in fact, in 1971, a few years before the building was actually built, Canada passed a Multicultural Act. And it was in order to reflect the very much heterogeneous social landscape of the Canadian people, and kind of giving a voice to the First Nations of Canada, and especially because of where the building is located, the First Nations of British Columbia. There's really a recognition about these Indigenous communities as part of the Canadian cultural landscape that are not anymore on the fringe, but actually glorified and appreciated within their community. But again, the architect tried to find a way to balance modernism and local tradition. And so by looking at the totems of the First Nations, Haid, I think is the name of one of them, which is shown. And these images on the left-hand side are really actually about the elements which are dispersed in the landscape of the building itself. If you can see in the bottom left image, there's this totem. It's a post and beam construction, and it should immediately kind of remind you of the post and beam construction of the building itself. Although it is stripped down of all its ornamentation, although it is in a different material, it's a very striking resemblance. And again, it goes to what I was trying to say earlier about its idea of citating something instead of actually replicating it, and removement of all ornaments for its actual essence of how it's built. Because really the structural ideas behind how this is built are quite simpler, right? It's a post and beam. It's what we've been taught to build in for centuries and centuries and millennia, really. There's an effort to reconnect to the landscape also of British Columbia, with the water, with the forestry. There are these mountains which are, inhabiting this landscape. The gravel pond, which is reflecting the sky and so on. It's bringing light into the building. And really, it's a building that is designed as a museum of anthropology, obviously, for all cultures, but it's really placing a strong emphasis on the First Nations, as you can see really from what is exhibited within it. On the left-hand side, you can see a plan about kind of the flow of people and of movement from the beginning of the building to this gray room, which we're seeing on the right. And you can see in the section that, as I was mentioning earlier, the topography of the campus, which is, yes, in one straight line, but also actually going up and down. It's kind of being replicated here. It's not just about opening up space and then closing up space, about compression and release. It is really about also reconnecting with the local topography, which I think is quite remarkable. It's a scaling down and up of this post and beam structural system, really, that is doing it. So it is quite essential and quite remarkable. There's a strong sense of monumentality, which is created by these oversized beams, and you can see it. It's a very clear and staggering reading, but again, it isn't in your face, and I don't think it's too flashy or too trying to stand out too much. And if you look at the work from the architect, he is also kind of replicating this idea of connecting with ancient ways in which something is built by reinterpreting it in a modern tradition, pretty much in all of his projects, but especially so within the ones that are in Canada. I have one last example for you. I think we have still about 15 minutes. I should take about 5 to go over this. This is a small home in India. It is in Mumbai. It's designed by Studio Mumbai, which is run by Bijoy Jain, and he studied in America and then worked in America, England, and then moved back to India himself. His work explores the relationship between architecture and land and the materials which we're using to build. Studio Mumbai is a very interesting organization because it operates both as an architectural office, but also as tradesmen. So they're both contractors and mill workers, but also architects. There's a strong understanding of how this is built. This is an image of their studio where they're doing all these large mock-ups for various projects. If you have it in the University of Oklahoma Library, I recommend checking out their issue on Albuquerque, the Spanish magazine. And they have, fascinating stories about how they operate. This house is organized around a courtyard, which is a common typology in India. Although, because it is near a river, which is prone to flooding, the house is actually raised in stilts. And the infill soil for this came from the actual retention walls and like water wells that were dug for the house itself. So the stilts are there, but they're quite well hidden, although it is still achieving a similar effect. You can see also just in the way in which the hardscaping is creating and building up. These stones are kind of like in this pattern, which isn't quite clear, isn't quite organized, but it's the same stone as the steps, which are instead of this very rigid geometry. And I think it's a very fascinating way of actually demarcating what is landscape and what is architecture, but also kind of controlling the flow of the water around the building. It's designed around the wind patterns of the air as well for best cross ventilation. And there is this kind of play and pattern of spaces within spaces, which are emphasizing this idea of cross ventilation. There's some areas which are clad in this concrete, white painted concrete, and these are instead bridge delays that are allowing for the air to kind of penetrate. This is an image of the courtyard where you really see this more solid volume, which is behind the rock, and then instead on its sides, this more like bridge delay organization. And it's creating kind of like a layering of different vistas and different ways of kind of inhabiting and living within the house. And these bridge delays can be organized, open, closed for different moments. To see the landscape to be more closer to the landscape or more, secluded from the landscape itself. Obviously, it also creates different levels of light and of privacy. It's also doing this, similar pattern of spaces within spaces in order to create 2 different programs. The ground floor is really all public spaces, except for the cores and white concrete, which we're seeing here, as that is housing, I believe, the bathrooms. So there's a reflection of the program in the materiality itself and in the way it is built. The concrete is this kind of hammered concrete, so they kind of create dimples to give it a bit more of texture. And then the roof is made of this, the top bar is made of this copper. And here you can see it from the outside. It's in this fantastic and beautiful vegetation that is incredibly lush, but it kind of sits very much detached from it almost, but also kind of reflecting the colors and the patterns that are kind of existing within the landscape itself. The copper roof is really to signify that those are elements which are completely private. The bedrooms are housed up there. And from what I understand, it's a teapot idea where you kind of have like a ceramic container and then you have a lid above it. And that's kind of the same idea that the architects are kind of having here. This copper roof is continuous and it's kind of cladding almost completely the second floor. And there are actually 2 separate blocks on the second floor, which are for separate. One is the main bedroom, one is 2 guest bedrooms. And this is also to create privacy amongst them. Here you can see on the right-hand side, various study models that the firm did to kind of create and play around these different patterns of spaces within spaces and different ideas of cross ventilation. And then on the left-hand side, because the firm itself is actually building the building, they don't quite produce actual construction documents, but they produce sketches, which are, I guess, similar to what we in America could produce as ASKs, architectural sketches, to provide further information for how something is framed and built. And you can see that even in the structure, there is a reflection, especially here in this image of construction, there's a reflection about these different layers of privacy in different spaces, which are very much rooted within how things are built within the local environment. You can see that all the public spaces are clad in this roof, and that the private ones are also this very heavy volume. And that there are actually, it seems like a very sophisticated structural system, which some of which are requiring some small C-beams. As you can see, the gentleman walking on top of it. And then there is a very precise way in which the actual wooden structure above on the second floor is laid out, that I'm assuming is laid out in a certain way because of the fenestration patterns. I have, a floor plan of this upper space. And here, even within it, you can see that there is this, again, play of spaces within spaces that is changing materiality and changing different light levels and ventilation levels. And here you can see, in fact, in this glass enclosure, which I believe is for the stair, how this is kind of coming alive and coming into play within the building itself. This is a shot of the, I believe, living room, and you can see how there is a complete connection between the outside and the interior courtyard, if you are wishing to keeping it completely open. And one of the things that's really remarkable this here is that as being in India, it is prone to heavy rainfalls, as is depicted in this image. And one of the things I've always was thinking about in reference to this building is how are they draining actually the center courtyard when all the water is actually shedding there. And after some research, I kind of realized that the pavers that they're using have enough spacing in between them in order to allow for the water to flow below them. Because if you can see here, the flooring in the interior and the flooring in the exterior are really almost in the same plane. So I was quite fascinated by how the water treatment of this happened. And it seems that it just kind of like has this porous ability to absorb water, let's say, and is kind of quite porous in itself. In a way, this attention to how the rain is affecting the building is very evident on the right-hand side image, where it kind of darkens it. It creates these patterns. And it's this water, if I've never been, but from what I understand, these monsoon water and downpours are very sudden and dramatic and violent. And I believe it kind of reflects these ephemeral qualities of the space itself. And it must be fantastic to actually be, covered within the roof and actually see this dramatic rainfall happening around it, a very phenomenological quality almost of the building itself. In closing, I wanted to emphasize that none of these ideas of reflecting local culture and identity in the built environment are new. They were always a given almost in the past because of how we used to build with local tradition, local materials, but that the totalizing meta narrative of modernity has actually forced some architects to kind of get back in touch with what was done before and kind of try and find different ways by which this is done, and different ways to fund these projects and different ways to build them, to go back to these more traditional ways of topology or materials or so on. And it's really a direct response to the anonymity of modernism that is kind of making modernism a necessity for the creation of critical regionalism in itself. So I don't think that as an idea could, and as an aesthetic idea, could have happened without the schism of modernism in itself. With that was all I had for today. Thank you for listening to me.